When a pig starts crying like a man, you don't just ignore it, you dig. Before we begin, if stories of hidden crimes, buried truth, and justice rising from the dust grip, you drop a 1 in the comments and subscribe now. And even if this isn't your style, smash that like button anyway. It helps more than you think. Stay until the end. There's a twist coming that'll flip everything upside down. Yet, for years, Elias Granger believed silence was strength. His land was quiet, his past locked away, and the world had mostly left him alone. But that all changed the moment his pig Billy let out a sound that no animal should ever make, deep, rattling, almost human. It wasn't hunger, it wasn't pain, it was mourning. And it came from a hole Billy had been obsessively digging for days. At first, Elias thought it was just another desert oddity, coyotes, rattlers, maybe old bones of some wild critter. But what he unearthed was a skeleton wrapped in government-issue cloth and a badge with blood still dried into the seams. This wasn't just history. This was murder, covered up, hidden, and now clawing its way back from the grave. His rage didn't come from what was buried. It came from realizing who buried it. His own bloodline, his family. The men who taught him to ride, shoot, and survive had also taught him to live on a lie. Now the past wasn't just haunting Elias, it was staring him down through the eyes of a pig who refused to stop digging. This isn't just another cowboy tale. It's a reckoning, and you won't believe how deep it goes. The sound that morning wasn't like the others. It wasn't the groan of old wood in the barn or the rustle of dry wind through the mesquite trees. It was sharp, deliberate, metal scraping against metal. Elias Granger shot up from his worn-out cot boots, still half-laced from the restless night before. He grabbed the rifle from the corner and stepped outside. The desert sun hadn't fully risen, but he could see just enough. Billy was back at the hole. But he wasn't digging. He was waiting for Elias to finish what had been started. Elias approached with dread he could taste in the back of his throat. He hadn't slept, not after what he'd uncovered, the badge, the bones, the whispers of a buried truth that wouldn't stay dead. And now this sound metallic echoing from the bottom of that cursed pit, as if the ground itself was trying to speak. When Elias leaned in, he saw it. Something glinting beneath the ribcage. Not bone, not stone. Steel. He dropped to his knees and, hands trembling, began pulling away the clay and dirt. Minutes later, he unearthed a small rusted strongbox, sealed tight with a leather strap. He hesitated. His heart pounded like hooves on dry earth. Then he unbuckled it. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents, photos, receipts, even currency from the 1920s, crisp, preserved. And worse than all of it, names. Dozens of them. Signed confessions, ledgers tied to smuggling routes, payroll lists, payoffs. The trail didn't end at his grandfather Jeremiah. It began with him. Every transaction, every bribe, every murder had been accounted for, filed, and hidden, buried in the very land that now bore the name Granger Ranch. Elias's breath caught, his gut churned. These weren't just records. They were the foundations of his family's entire legacy. The faces in those old family portraits on his wall. The proud men with their stiff collars and cold stares weren't pioneers. They were criminals, organized, calculated, ruthless. They'd silenced a federal agent to keep their empire afloat, and now, 100 years later, Elias was the only one standing between truth and silence. He wanted to scream, not just out of horror, but out of betrayal. His father, who died whispering about honor. His grandfather, whose journals he had read as a boy, like sacred scripture. Everything he had ever believed about his bloodline, his land, his purpose, a lie. Bought and paid for with bones and bullets. Elias stumbled backward, the strongbox still in his arms. He looked at Billy, whose eyes reflected a strange, knowing calm, as if the pig had known this moment was coming all along. As if justice had chosen him to carry the weight no one else could. But what now? Elias couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. Not with these names. These men, or their descendants, still walked free. Some of them still held office. Controlled banks, owned police, shaped policy. He flipped one page and stopped cold. Luke Dobson, the current sheriff. The same man who had once warned Elias to mind his family's good name. Dobson was the great-grandson of Lewis Dobson, the man who, according to these papers, had orchestrated shipments of stolen military rifles across state lines in 1923, using Granger Ranch as a drop point. The date was circled in red ink. One day after Agent Boone disappeared. Elias felt the familiar anger rise again, but this time it was different, sharper, righteous. He would not let the past bury the truth again. He gathered every document and headed to the house. That night, he worked in silence, scanning, photographing, uploading everything to encrypted drives. He mailed copies to newspapers, cold case task forces, historical commissions across the state. He made backups of backups, and then he waited. But they moved if 2 nights later, a pickup truck parked on the edge of the property. Its headlights never turned off. Elias watched from the window, shotgun on his lap. Billy sat beside the door like a sentry. No one got out of the truck. It just sat there, watching. The next morning, the mailbox had been smashed. A warning, a message that said, "We know," but Elias didn't back down. He couldn't. Not anymore. Later that day, he returned to the site of the grave. Billy followed close behind his steps, slow and deliberate. Elias stood at the edge of the pit, badge in one hand, strongbox in the other, and whispered, "You were right to keep digging." Because the truth hadn't just been buried, it had been weaponized. And now that weapon was loaded again, pointed at him. But Elias was ready to pull the trigger. If this story shakes you like it did, Elias, drop a 1 in the comments and subscribe to the channel. If it makes your blood boil, hit like to keep the story alive. And don't go anywhere, because what Elias finds next might burn the last bridge he has left. The next morning broke under a blood-orange sky, bruised and swollen like something was festering in the air. Elias Granger stood in the same place he had every morning for the last 30 years, boots in the dust, coffee burning, his tongue rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. But nothing felt the same. Nothing had since Billy unearthed bones that shouldn't have been there. And now, Elias couldn't unsee what was coming. The envelopes he had mailed were out there now, one to a state investigator, one to an old journalist who owed him a favor, and another to a former federal marshal who once looked into cold cases for fun and revenge. He hadn't signed them. He hadn't needed to. The silence he'd grown up believing was safety was breaking open, and it was loud. As he walked the fence line, he noticed fresh boot prints in the dirt. Not his ranch hands. Someone had been here just beyond the barn, pacing in the shadows like a ghost, unsure whether to make itself known. The prints led to the back of the house, then vanished. The kind of disappearance only someone trained could pull off. He knew the message. We were here. We could have done more. We didn't this time. That night, Elias didn't light the porch lamp. He sat in the dark, shotgun by his leg, Billy lying quietly by the steps like a shadow sculpted from muscle and instinct. The pig had stopped pacing. He was still, now coiled like a spring, listening to things no human could hear. And then it happened. A low thump, not a knock, not wind. The sound of something dropped, not meant to be noticed until it was too late. Elias found the package on the porch the next morning, brown paper, no return, no tape. Inside, a single Polaroid. It was of his father, tied to a chair in the old horse shed, his face bloody, one eye swollen shut. Elias stumbled back, heart-skipping beats, air sucked from his lungs. His father had died in that very shed, or so he'd always been told. Heart attack, they said. Peaceful. But this photo, grainy and cruel, told a different story. And worse, the timestamp at the bottom read, October 14th, 1985, a week before the funeral, a week before the closed casket. He dropped to his knees. His father hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been silenced. Suddenly, the loose threads of stories he'd heard growing up snapped taut. The warnings to never dig too deep. The way his grandfather refused to talk about Boone. The respect they paid to old landmarks like the dry well or the burned-out bunkhouse. They weren't traditions. They were boundaries. Markers for graves. Rage came slowly this time, like rising water, heavy and full of pressure. He could feel it pressing behind his eyes, tightening around his chest. They'd killed his father, covered it, lied to him every day since. And now they were daring him to stay quiet too. That evening, Elias returned to the horse shed. He hadn't been in it for years, not since it had been abandoned, left to rot under broken shingles and sagging beams. But when he opened the door, it was like walking into a crime scene preserved in dust. Chains hung from one rafter. There were dark stains on the floor, too wide to be oil, too thick to be forgotten. He stepped deeper in and noticed something half buried under hay and wood scraps, a small wooden box the size of a cigar case. Inside, a broken badge. His father's name etched faintly in the steel, not military, not sheriff, just Granger. It wasn't official, it was symbolic. His father had been involved maybe not in the crimes, but in the effort to expose them. Elias suddenly remembered being 10 years old and seeing his dad come home late, hands shaking, eyes haunted. He'd been trying to end it, and they had ended him instead. Elias sat down in the dirt of the shed, his back against the same post they'd tied his father to. And he cried, not because he was weak, because the storm had finally reached his bones. God. By morning, Elias had made up his mind. He wasn't just going to expose them. He was going to name them. All of them. Using the records, the photographs, and the personal notes found in Boone's files, he began compiling a document. Not a report, not a letter, a ledger of shame. He started with the founding generation: Jeremiah Granger, Lewis Dobson, Hollis Keene, Carl Perrin. Then came their sons and daughters, and now their grandchildren. Every one of them tied by blood oath or silence to the death of Silas Boone and to others before and after. He made copies, dozens, hidden around the ranch, some buried in waterproof tins, others mailed in secret. He wasn't naive, he wouldn't live through what was coming. But the story would. The last name on the list wasn't a politician. It wasn't a banker or lawman. It was his own, Elias Granger, because he knew that silence even through ignorance makes you complicit. And by breaking it, he was becoming the first Granger in 3 generations to choose truth. Outside, the wind picked up. Dust swirled like ghosts looking for their names. Billy stood at the gate staring toward the horizon, his snout lifted high like he could smell something coming. And Elias knew. It wasn't over. Not yet. The third night was different. The stars above Coyote Ridge had always brought Elias a strange comfort, constant, steady out of reach. But tonight they looked wrong, distant, faint. As if even the sky didn't want to witness what was about to happen. The dogs didn't bark. The crickets had gone silent. Even the wind held its breath. Elias sat at the old kitchen table lit by the soft hum of a single lamp. Spread before him were the documents, photographs, the list of names, his family's legacy, bleeding out across yellowed pages and cracked ink. That was when the lights went out. AE. He'd already loaded the shotgun. Already rigged the perimeter of the ranch with wires and cans, crude but loud. He'd been expecting them. A soft creak came from the porch. Then a whisper, low, controlled, meant to intimidate. "Put it all back where you found it, old man." He recognized the voice. "Sheriff." Elias rose slowly and stepped toward the door, boots heavy on the floorboards. He didn't open it. He didn't. "You come all this way to finish what your great-granddaddy started?" he asked. At least he had the SP. There was a pause. Then another voice, deeper, more calculated. "You've made this complicated, Granger." That wasn't Dobson. That was someone else. Elias couldn't place it, but the tone carried weight, the kind that didn't get elected, it got inherited. Outside, tires crunched against dirt. More vehicles, more men. They weren't here to negotiate. This wasn't a scare tactic, it was cleanup. He turned to Billy, who stood stiff by the door. Hairs bristled along his back like barbed wire. The pig didn't make a sound, but his stance was clear: he'd defend the threshold with his life. So would Elias. Yet. The first explosion came from the barn. A fireball of light and debris shot into the air as the old structure collapsed inward with a deafening roar. The strong box, the evidence, the hidden trunks gone in seconds. They hadn't come to steal, they'd come to erase. Elias threw open the back door and ran toward the fence line. He didn't care if they followed. He didn't care if they shot. What they hadn't known was that he'd made copies of everything, not just physical ones. He'd uploaded files to off-site servers scheduled to release automatically to the press, the state, the federal investigators, even the local university's history department. Time-stamped, watermarked, impossible to contain. What was in the barn was bait, but the fire didn't slow them down. Shots rang out. He ducked behind a trough, bullets splintering the wooden rails above his head. His shoulders slammed into dirt. He fired once, not to hit, but to warn. Then another sound, a scream. Not human. Billy. The pig charged through smoke and gunfire, tearing across the field like a locomotive. One of the men hadn't seen him coming. The impact was brutal, bone on bone. The man went down hard, screaming, but then came the shot. Billy staggered. He swayed legs, trembling eyes, blinking slow. "No," Elias shouted, pushing off the ground. He ran to Billy's side just as the animal collapsed, breathing shallow blood staining the dust beneath him. The rage inside Elias exploded. White-hot, blinding, every part of him that still believed in decency or logic or compromise evaporated in that moment. He picked up Billy's bloodied body and dragged him toward the porch, his shotgun clenched in one hand, eyes locked on the enemy. "I buried your lies," he growled. "Now you'll choke on the truth." Us. But the standoff didn't last. Sirens wailed in the distance, not county, but federal. Blue and red lights tore across the dark like fire slicing through oil. The convoy that roared over the ridge wasn't local. It was bigger than them now. A black SUV skidded to a halt between Elias and the advancing shooters. Armed agents poured out. "Drop your weapons!" a voice thundered. The attackers hesitated. One by one they surrendered. Except Dobson. He tried to run. Two agents tackled him into the dust before he made it to the tree line. Elias dropped to his knees beside Billy. The pig's breaths came slower now, nostrils flaring with effort. His eyes met Elias's, tired but proud, fierce, defiant. "I'm sorry," Elias whispered, pressing his palm against Billy's side. "You did more than any man ever did." The pig gave one final grunt, then went still, and something in Elias broke for good. They let him bury Billy behind the house just past the hill where the sunrise always hit first. No stone, no plaque, just a marker carved with Boone's badge and the words, "He never stopped digging." The agents found what remained of the network buried in decades of corruption. Files, DNA evidence, hidden assets, all triggered by Elias's scheduled release. Within weeks, arrests followed. D.A. Keene, Senator Dobson, even the governor's chief of staff names scrawled on papers that had survived a century underground. But it didn't feel like victory. Elias couldn't unsee what he'd seen. Couldn't unkill what had been killed. He gave up most of the land, turned it over to the state for historical preservation. What remained was a small corner of prairie, a cabin and a field where a pig had once refused to let the dead stay buried. Now Elias walked the earth not with pride but with purpose. Because even after the truth comes out, someone has to carry the weight of it. And he carried it for both of them. The days that followed Billy's death passed like smoke, blurred, bitter, and impossible to hold. Elias didn't speak much, not to the agents, not to the press, not even to the neighbor who dropped off hot bread and didn't ask questions. The porch swing creaked again, but this time without rhythm. Without Billy nudging it with his snout. The silence he once sought had returned, but now it howled. It mocked him. He had won, but it felt like defeat. What do you do after you bury your conscience? The agents had packed up. The arrests had made headlines. The state called it a historic reckoning, a public vice, but Elias had read every line of Boone's final report. And he knew the names that made it into the newspapers. They weren't the worst of them. They were pawns, mid-level players, sacrificial offerings tossed to the wolves to protect. Because the deeper you dug into power, the less you foe. That realization came not from a briefing or file folder, but from a late-night visit. A unmarked envelope, one sheet of paper. Ty, you've stirred up a storm, but the storm doesn't reach the mountain. You ate, as I ask, and beer eli den. He lit, he the land ha. But something deeper had awakened in him it was Denver was colder than he remembered. The city had risen on oil concrete and memory. But the buildings still whispered secrets if you listened right. Elias moved like a ghost through the old districts, tracing rumors and fragments, following the invisible trail left by Boone and others who'd come close before they disappeared. He found his answer in an old archivist named Marjorie Flynn, retired librarian, former civil records analyst, sharp eyes, sharper tongue. "You're lucky I still hate those bastards," she muttered, sliding a file across the diner table. Inside were blueprints of a decommissioned federal warehouse built in 1921. The name on the permit, Raven's Hollow Agricultural Supply Affront. But what lay beneath it told a different story. Sub-basements, lock chambers, armored vaults. It wasn't a storage site, it was a war room. And according to a folded set of notes left behind by someone only listed as S.B. Boone himself, had been there in 1923, 3 days before his death. Marjorie lit a cigarette with gnarled fingers and said quietly, "Whatever's down there didn't just kill your agent. It funded the men who kept killing for decades after." Elias nodded. He didn't flinch. He was done flinching. Quiet. That night, Elias broke into Raven's Hollow. He'd expected silence, maybe decay, but what he found was worse. It was alive. Clean corridors, working lights, digital locks on reinforced doors. Someone had kept this place operational even as it vanished from maps. In one room, he found stacks of currency outdated denominations carefully wrapped and sealed in plastic, stamped with Federal Reserve codes from the 1940s, 50s, 60s. Money laundering in slow motion. Another chamber held documents, dossiers, surveillance files, names, addresses, family trees, the bloodlines of control. He saw his own name, his father's, Boone's, even Billy's file. Someone had kept records on the pig, and then he saw it tucked into a side drawer. A reel of 8mm film. Labeled Boone Interrogation. September 14, 1923. He didn't have to watch it, but he did. The film stuttered to life on a projector in the corner. Black and white, grainy. Boone sat in a chair, hands cuffed, face battered, still defiant. Behind him, shadowed figures, unnamed. See, the you can kill me, but this will not stay buried. You He grabbed every document he could, took photos, downloaded digital records, set backup transfers, and the X. By the time the story broke, Raven's Hollow was ash. But the evidence released to 6 newsrooms, 2 law enforcement agencies, and 1 federal court was impossible to bury. It revealed a century-old network tied to congressional appropriations, land fraud, and wartime profiteering. A network that had sacrificed hundreds to keep the money flowing. Elias returned to Coyote Ridge for the last time. He sat by Billy's grave, boots dusted from 100 miles of fury. He wasn't proud. He wasn't clean. But for the first time in his life, he felt done. And in the wind, he swore he heard a snort. Not pain, not grief, just peace. Elias didn't expect the second letter. Not after Raven's Hollow burned, not after the media storm, not after Billy's body was buried with Boone's badge under the cottonwood tree. But it came anyway. No stamp, no return address. Just a single sheet of ivory paper pressed beneath a smooth river stone on Billy's grave. You've cut the branches, but the roots remain. You've earned your headlines. Now walk away. You'll be paid. You'll be left alone. But if you keep digging, you'll find more than you're ready to carry. No name, no signature, no threats, just facts. It was a tone Elias knew too well, the voice of power that didn't need to shout. The kind of voice that had whispered through his bloodline for a century. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into the pocket of his worn flannel, and didn't tell a soul. 2 days later, the offer arrived. A man in a charcoal suit pulled into the ranch at sunrise. He was young, well-groomed, and didn't look like he'd ever held a shovel. He never gave his name. Just handed Elias a sealed manila folder and said, "This is the final chapter. Read it, sign it, walk away." Inside a non-disclosure agreement, a land grant, reaffirmation, and access credentials to a foreign trust account worth over $8 million. $8 million to forget. To delete. To let history rot in peace. The document was written in soft legalese, but its weight was brutal. Sign here, and your father never fought. Boone never died. Billy never bled. The past never screamed. And if you don't sign, the consequences were unwritten, but they echoed in every name Boone had uncovered. Accidents, suicides, vanishings, the silence of men too close to the truth. Elias stood at the window for hours. That night, the folder unopened on the table, the light above flickering like it wanted to die too. The house felt hollow. The land outside stretched black and still. Billy was gone. The agents were gone. The cameras had stopped showing up. The town had returned to pretending. And now, it was just him, a name with a choice. He walked out to the grave just before dawn. The wind moved slowly through the field, like it was trying not to disturb the dead. Elias crouched next to the mound, fingers pressed into the cool earth. "I sign they leave me alone," he whispered. "They stop digging. I stop bleeding." Silence. Then, as if summoned by the absurdity of peace, his hand brushed something strange in the dirt. Wood, old, damp. He dug bare hands, scraping through clay until he pulled free a small cedar box. No markings, no lock, just age and weight. Inside was a journal, not Boone's field notes, not a copy, the original, leather-bound hand-stitched. Still smelled faintly of oil and sweat. The pages were filled with Boone's handwriting, tighter now, more frantic than the reports Elias had read. These weren't for the record. These were for himself, for truth, for insurance. And on page 147, Elias found what the letter had warned him about. Names. Not the ones already arrested. Not the ones the media had crucified. These were higher, older. Senators, judges, CEOs, men who had taken their father's crimes and franchised them into modern empire. They'd traded cattle rustling for federal contracts, gun smuggling for pharmaceutical lobbying, bribery for digital blackmail. They hadn't vanished, they'd evolved. And they still ran the country. That folder in his house wasn't a settlement, it was a muzzle. And Elias felt the burn of rage rise in him again, hotter than the fire that took his barn, sharper than the bullet that dropped Billy. He could walk away, take the money, live quietly on the corner of a broken legacy. Or he could finish this, even if it meant dying for it. He went back inside, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, and stared at the two items on the table. The folder, the journal. Silence sat beside him like an old friend waiting. At sunrise, he made his decision. He scanned the entire journal, uploaded it to 3 encrypted servers, mailed physical copies to 5 investigative journalists, each with instructions to release them if anything happened to him. He drove into town that afternoon, walked into the local courthouse, and filed a federal affidavit under oath. He named every person in the journal. Then he drove home, poured a glass of bourbon, and watched the sky. He knew what would come next, but this time he was ready. Not because he was fearless, but because he had already lost everything fear could take. Todd. If you followed Elias's journey this far, comment, "I remember" below and subscribe so you don't miss the final reckoning. If you don't want to remember, click like anyway. Some truths deserve to haunt us. Next time you'll see how far power is willing to go to keep its roots buried and whether justice can finally burn them out. Elias Granger had made his choice. He stood by it unflinching. But that didn't mean he slept well. After the affidavit was filed and the journal distributed, the world didn't change overnight. There was no grand televised confession, no public apology from men in suits, just silence deeper than before. Denser. Even the air on his ranch felt different, heavy, as if the land knew it had betrayed too many bones to breathe easy again. The federal marshal he spoke to promised follow-ups, promised that a task force would be reviewing the evidence. But Elias had seen enough of how the system functioned to understand the code behind those words. Delay, distance, dilution. They wouldn't kill him, not now, not after the evidence had been sent out, but they could erase him in other ways, make him invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. The system was allergic to reckoning, and still, something kept moving in the background. On the 3rd day after his filing, he woke up to tire tracks circling the ranch. No engine, no headlights, no sound in the night, just perfectly coiled arcs in the dirt looping around his house, stopping just short of the cottonwood tree. A message, not for him, for whoever might be watching. He sat on the porch with his rifle and waited. At midnight, a light flickered in the distance, too low to be stars, too red to be a flare. The old well was glowing. He hadn't gone near it in years, not since he was a boy, and his father warned him never to stir the roots. It had been boarded shut, chained with rusted iron, and ignored. Now the boards were gone. He walked toward it slowly, boots crunching dry weeds underfoot. The wind carried no scent. No night insects chirped. Just that steady, flickering red light pulsing like a dying heartbeat. When he reached the edge, he looked down. There was no flame, no torch, just a soft shimmer like phosphorescence or something older. And in the dirt beside the well, a new object. A photograph. It was black and white, torn at the edges, the kind you'd find buried in a trunk behind moth-eaten clothes. It showed a man standing at the base of the cottonwood, hand resting on a pig's back. The pig was Billy, but the man wasn't Elias. It was his father. And he was holding a journal, Boone's journal. Elias staggered back. His stomach dropped. How Boone's original journal had only just resurfaced, or so he thought. Had his father found it first? Had he buried it again, hoping Elias would someday be strong enough to face it? Or was this a warning? He turned the photo over, written in faded pencil. The truth isn't what sets you free. It's what buries you properly. So, the next morning, he called the marshal again. No answer. Tried the journalist in Nevada. Line disconnected. Even the cold case investigator from Washington who'd once thanked him for breaking the firewall gone. Not even voicemail. They had vanished. Or they had been vanished. He checked the GPS logs of his email uploads. The encrypted drives were still active, but all the downloads had been traced to the same IP, a shell address in Virginia. Langley. The truth hadn't gone public. It had gone underground, swallowed by the very system it condemned. For days, Elias debated his next move. Burn it all again, leave, stay, and fight. But what fight remained when the beast simply changed its skin and kept walking? He found the answer not in a file or a whisper or even a memory, but in sound. One night, as rain started to fall for the first time in months, he heard it. From inside the barn, a slow, steady snort. He hadn't set foot in there since the fire. The new roof had barely been finished. The floorboards still smelled of ash and char, but the sound had been real. He followed it, heart hammering. Inside, everything was still. Silent. Then he saw it. In the stall where Billy used to sleep, in the very corner where he used to dig, the dirt had shifted. No animal prints, no wind. But the earth had opened again. He knelt, reached in, and pulled out a second journal, bound in red leather. Unmarked, he opened it. Inside, not Boone's words, but his father's. Detailed entries, conversations, betrayals. A record of every meeting, every confrontation, every time he'd tried to warn others and been ignored. And near the end, I left the rest for you. If you found this, they're watching. They'll never stop. But now you know what must be done. And if you're not ready to burn the house down, make sure you salt the ground. Elias sat on the barn floor for hours, rain pounding the roof above. He'd thought the choice had already been made. But now he saw he hadn't chosen war. Not yet. He'd chosen to open the door. Now the fire would come through. And this time he wouldn't run. Yet. Somewhere in the distance, a phone rang, but Elias didn't answer. He was busy digging. In 2025, when truth is often drowned out by algorithms, filtered images, and corporate-controlled narratives, Elias Granger's story feels more than historical. It feels urgent. His stand against a century-old network of corruption reminds us that evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it wears suits, holds office, and smiles on television. Elias taught us that justice doesn't arrive when we expect it. It arrives when someone is brave enough to risk everything for it. Reputation, safety, even peace. In a world where misinformation spreads faster than accountability, the idea that a pig, a forgotten journal, and one grieving man could shake the foundations of a powerful empire is not just poetic. It's prophetic. This story isn't just about exposing the past. It's about recognizing that systems built on lies don't crumble. When the truth is whispered, they fall when someone dares to shout it, even if no one listens at first. We live in a time when silence is rewarded and complicity disguised as patriotism. But Elias's refusal to walk away offers us a roadmap. His pain, his losses, his fire. They remind us that healing only begins after reckoning. And now in 2025, the question isn't what Elias should do next. It's what we should do with what he's uncovered. God. If you believe Elias deserves justice not just for himself but for all those buried by silence, comment below what you think his next step should be. Should he go public again? Write a book. Join the movement to investigate cold cases across the country. Let us know. This isn't just his fight anymore, it's ours.